Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are in this globe of ours. I want to welcome you all to the 5th event in IAFFE's series on the COVID crisis, COVID in racialized and marginalized communities. I'm James Hines, I'm the chair of the membership committee of IAFFE, and I just have a few announcements before we get started. And these announcements are for IAFFE members, all you IAFFE members out there. So next Wednesday, June 24th, is the IAFFE membership meeting. We usually have this at the annual conference, but since the annual conference has been postponed until 2021, we're doing it online. So it's taking place next Wednesday. It's going to take place 1 hour before whatever time it is right now for you. And so that's the time for the IAFFE membership meeting, and more information should be coming to you in the next several days. We also are kind of switching up the programming with these online events. We have, in terms of content and format, our next scheduled event is a book publishing workshop, how to get your book published. It's scheduled for Friday, July 10th. It's going to feature Lee Badgett, Matti Conte, and Caroline Hussein. And so I welcome you all to look for that. Again, this event is specifically for IAFFE members. So those are my two announcements, and I would now like to introduce our moderator for today's online event, Lynda Pickbourn. Lynda's based at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and she's also an IAFFE board member, and she's gonna lead you all through today's online event. So that's it from me, and I'm turning it over to you, Lynda.
Thank you, James. Hello, everyone. I am pleased to have this opportunity to moderate this important and timely discussion on COVID-19 in racialized and marginalized communities, the 5th in the series of panel discussions that IAFFE has organized on the COVID-19 pandemic. As we all know, the impact of the pandemic has been disproportionately greater among marginalized communities worldwide, and recent events in the United States make that fact even more poignant. Today we have 4 scholars and activists who will explore its impact on the various communities with which they work. Our first speaker, Amie Bishop, is a human rights advocate and global health leader with professional experience in more than 20 countries. She currently works with Outright Action International, a global LGBTIQ human rights organization, as its senior research advisor. She is the author of its recent report, Vulnerability Amplified: The Impact of COVID-19 on LGBTIQ People Globally. In 2019, she authored Outright's report entitled Harmful Treatments: The Global Reach of So-Called Conversion Therapy. From 2008 to 2017, she served on Outright's board of directors and was board co-chair for 3 years. From 1989 to 2014, she worked for PATH, a nonprofit global health organization. Ms. Bishop is an adjunct clinical instructor at the University of Washington's Department of Global Health and holds master's degrees in social work and public health, both from Columbia University. Cruz Bueno, our second speaker, is assistant professor of Black Studies at the State University of New York, New Paltz. She is an economist specializing in economic development, gender violence, and the political economy of race, gender, and class inequality. She is the recipient of the 2014 Rhonda Williams Prize from the International Association for Feminist Economics. Her quantitative and qualitative work has been funded by the Inter-American Foundation's Grassroots Development Fellowship and has been published in Feminist Economics and the Review of Black Political Economy. Next, we have Judith LeBlanc, who I'm not sure, has Judith joined us yet? Or maybe she may be joining.
No, not yet, but I think you can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Should be a little late.
Okay, she is a member of the Caddo tribe of Oklahoma. From 2005 to 2008, she was the national co-chair of United for Peace and Justice, an organization that she helped found. She is nationally recognized as a leader of the US Peace and Justice Movement and currently serves as director of the Native Organizers Alliance, a national Native organizing network which provides Native organizers, tribal governments, and nonprofits with training and support for strategic campaign planning and community engagements based on indigenous values and practices. LeBlanc has also been a media producer and correspondent with the Laura Flanders Show, Democracy Now!, and several PBS films. Our fourth speaker, Michelle Holder, is an assistant professor of economics at John Jay College, City University of New York. Prior to joining the John Jay faculty, she worked professionally as an economist for over a decade in both the nonprofit and government sectors. Her research focuses on Blacks and women in the American labor market, and her economic policy reports have been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Amsterdam News, and El Diario. Her first book, African American Men and the Labor Market During the Great Recession, was released from Palgrave in 2017. Michelle's educational background includes master's and doctoral degrees in economics from the New School of Social Research in New York City, and a bachelor's degree in economics from Fordham University. Today is June 19th, a date that holds special meaning for African Americans because of its significance in the history of slavery in the United States. Before we begin the discussion, I would like to invite Michelle Holder to take a few minutes to acknowledge and recognize the importance of this date. Over to you, Michelle.
Oh, just one second, Michelle. I think you can unmute yourself now.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, thanks, Jihi. And thank you so much, Lynda, as well as James. As Lynda introduced me, I'm Michelle Holder. I am at John Jay College, City University of New York. And I'm so pleased to be part of this very important panel on what is a really important day for African Americans. And so before I talk a little bit about Juneteenth, let me just share some really great information that was released this morning from the mayor of my city, New York City, Mayor de Blasio, who announced that Juneteenth would indeed be recognized as a city holiday going forward in 2021, which is awesome. Also, just this week, I believe the mayor of the state, New York State, I'm sorry, the governor, the governor also announced that this day would be recognized this year, but that he would push for legal recognition of it next year. So these are really good signs for the observance of an important holiday. So just quickly, allow me to put Juneteenth in context for some who may not know really about the holiday. So the American Civil War occurred from April 1861 to April 1865. And in September 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which would take effect on January 1863. Now, that proclamation was really akin to a presidential executive order. But because the country was still engaged in civil war at the time of the proclamation, if you were enslaved in a Confederate state and could not escape, in effect, you were still enslaved, proclamation or not. Now, Texas was the remotest of all Confederate states, and it wasn't until a Union Army general announced on June 19, 1865, 2 months after the Civil War ended, the federal order that all enslaved were thenceforth free, that slavery truly ended for all African Americans in the United States. This is why this day is so important to African Americans. We did have the Emancipation Proclamation, but in effect, Juneteenth is the day when we were all liberated. It's really sort of the July 4th for African Americans, if I can put it that way. Of course, most of us, if not all of us on this phone call know the 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865, which then officially and legally made the practice of slavery illegal in the US, with, of course, the notable exception of prisoners. And thank you for allowing me to talk about that, Lynda.
Thank you, Michelle, for reminding us all about the significance of Juneteenth to African Americans, as well as to all people who care about racial and economic justice. So we will now move on to the panel discussion. Each speaker will have 8 to 10 minutes to speak. And after all the panelists have spoken, the remaining time will be devoted to a facilitated discussion. Our first speaker is Amie Bishop, a human rights advocate and global health leader with professional experience in more than 20 countries, and currently senior research advisor at Outright Action International. Over to you, Amie.
Okay, thank you. I think my volume is on. I really sincerely want to thank you all for including me on this panel. Thank you to Lee Badgett, I think, who had suggested reaching out, and I'm really honored to be with you today, especially on this very auspicious day. And in this important month also of Pride Month, which I think we need to recall was led, the liberation movement really started at Stonewall, led by queer, Black and brown, trans and queer people. And I think that's a part of our history that doesn't get elevated enough. And so it's a very important time right now. I wanted just to say a couple of words about Outright Action International for those that may not be familiar with us. We've been around for 30 years, focused on defending and advancing LGBTIQ human rights and equality globally. We're very much a feminist organization. We work intersectionally. We deeply adhere to the notion that we cannot achieve queer justice without racial justice, economic justice, gender justice. And that is the lens through which we do our work. We're based in New York City. I myself sit in Seattle, Washington. We have staff and board on 5 continents, and we work primarily through 3 strategies. First is research and documentation, because we need to understand what is happening to our communities around the world, and that's what we use. The stories and the evidence of people's lives is what we use for our advocacy work. Movement resourcing really is referring to the technical assistance and training and support to grassroots partners who are severely under-resourced. We're not a philanthropic organization per se, but we do onward small granting to grassroots movements. And then finally, advocacy. And a really important core piece of our advocacy work is at the United Nations, where we work to hold governments accountable, in particular to including LGBTIQ lives within the broader global global human rights agenda. We're very much a partnership-based organization. We have staff of just 20 people, so we really need to work and must work with our partners shoulder to shoulder around the world. Next slide, please. So we decided to undertake back in March, as the pandemic was unfolding across the world, a rapid assessment of what is happening to LGBTIQ people around the world. We know from literature and past experience that our communities do suffer disproportionately and are often left behind in general, but particularly in times of crisis as a result of discrimination and exclusion. And so we, in very short order, decided to set out to characterize how the pandemic, and particularly the measures to curb the transmission, were affecting our lives and movements. We undertook interviews with 59 people from 38 countries over basically a 2-week period, end of March, early April. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick picture of where we the people's where they were located who were interviewed. We tried really hard, even with a relatively small number, to get good geographic diversity as well as diversity in identity. So about a third of our respondents were identified, a little under a third identified as transgender, self-identified. A little more than a third identified as gay or lesbian, and the remaining identified as queer, bisexual, non-binary, gender non-conforming, or didn't specify, and 3 respondents were intersex. Next, please. So what did we find out of this work? The key message here is that queer people around the world very quickly fell into poverty, into food insecurity, whether directly from the virus or from the economic fallout that has resulted around the world in job loss, in hunger, lack of access to other healthcare, et cetera. So we were able to parse out these 7 themes, a few of which I'll talk more in detail about. But let me just say that it really was, even given that at the time of the interviews, the pandemic was in different stages and phases around the world. And so, you know, it still hadn't hit hard yet in many parts of the world, such as in sub-Saharan Africa, which is now changing. And yet the economic fallout was nevertheless already impacting people, even where the virus had not yet taken hold. Next slide, please. So on the theme of devastation of livelihoods and food insecurity, I think like many people who are already on the brink of poverty or struggling economically, they were presented with, and are continuing to be presented with, a bit of a false choice, which is, do I continue to expose myself to a potential, you know, infection with this virus, or do I shelter at home to the extent that that's even possible, and give up the possibility of earning enough money for food on a day-to-day basis. We know that many queer people around the world work primarily in informal sector, day-to-day, hourly wage kinds of work. This has historical roots in the fact that in many countries, 68 countries around the world, still criminalize being gay. So, and among those, about 45 criminalize women specifically, same-sex relations, and about 57 countries criminalize in some form being transgender. So you're talking about populations around the world that are already marginalized, excluded, and denied access to rights to education. So when we talk about the pre-existing conditions exacerbating the impact of COVID, well, for queer people in a lot of countries around the world, pre-existing conditions are exclusion, violence, and discrimination, just as it is for other marginalized populations, I think. One of the things I wanted to mention on this is that we did see and hear about support being provided by state or by NGOs in the way of like food packs, but availability didn't mean accessibility. So for example, in Sri Lanka, food was being distributed through police stations. Sri Lanka is one of the countries where being queer is criminalized. So accessing food through police is not going to be viable. Next slide, please. Disruptions in healthcare, I'll go quickly here. We heard quite a lot about the pre-existing status for many people as being discriminated within the healthcare system. And so there was great reluctance to seek care, even if exhibiting symptoms of the virus. That trans people in particular felt that they were suffering from the point of view of both not having access to gender affirming care and hormones, as well as being cut off, many people being cut off from HIV medications. Next slide. Fears of societal stigma, discrimination, and scapegoating. We won't have to spend time on this, but in a lot of countries, what you're hearing is the pandemic is being caused by queer communities, the sins of our lives, etc. Next slide. And then finally, and just give me 30 seconds to wrap up here. Finally, concerns about organizational survival. Many frontline grassroots organizations in countries around the world are driving the fight for human rights, for dignity, for freedom. And this pandemic is potentially setting back movements around the world because of the threat to losing resources and to needing to face the very specific needs that are emerging, basic necessities that are emerging within the communities. So we can skip the last slide. I'll just say that we're taking these stories, these data, and working hard to put them in front of key actors who are involved in pandemic response around the world, humanitarian agencies, donors, and other NGOs. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Amie. Our next speaker is Cruz Bueno, Assistant Professor of Black Studies at State University of New York and New Paltz, and an economist specializing in economic development, gender violence, and the political economy of race, gender, and class. Over to you, Cruz.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynda, for the introduction, Dr. Pickbourn. I am honored to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. As Dr. Pickbourn said, my name is Cruz Bueno, and I am an assistant professor of Black Studies at SUNY New Paltz. The title of my comments is Corona y la Comunidad, Insights from the Latinx Community. The Latino community is struggling. We were suffering before the COVID-19 crisis, family separations at the border, children in cages, Hurricane Maria, police brutality, deportations, and fear of deportations. This pandemic has intensified the suffering, the stress, and anxiety we experience in this racist and xenophobic society, especially within the current political climate. Immigrants in the United States form an integral part of the labor market and keep the country at replacement population rates, averting the economic crisis associated with falling population rates we see in other parts of the world. Yet our contributions are devalued and our rights to exist peacefully in America are constantly challenged. Next slide, please. Thank you. To speak about the Latinx community, and I may use Latino, Latina community interchangeably with Latinx, but to speak about the Latinx community in America is challenging because we are a diverse ethnic group comprising of all races. Latinos, the Latinx community, we come from 20 countries, 4 independent territories, speaking over 500 languages. I think that what I will say in these brief 10 minutes, we will hear in other people, and even what Amie was talking about, because Latinos we are also queer. And so what we'll see, and Latinos are Black, Asian, Native American as well. So we will see that there'll be reoccurring themes. And I want to also state, a large number of the Latinx community reject the term Hispanic, as it is a US imposed term that inaccurately describes the racial origins of Latinx people. Currently, we're 18.3% of the US population, 60 million people. By 2050, we're projected to be 30% of the US population. Next slide, please. There are many factors that put us at risk for contracting and dying of COVID-19. Latinx communities are the least likely of ethnic groups in the United States to have medical coverage, more likely to report poor communication with health providers, and less likely to trust medical and public health officials. We have disproportionately high rates of diabetes, obesity, and high blood pressure. In New York City, the death rate for COVID-19 was highest amongst the Latino population. We see rising cases in places with large Latinx populations such as Texas, Florida, Arizona, and Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico is especially alarming because we have seen the way that US government policy has thwarted economic progress in Puerto Rico, which held much needed funds to rebuild Puerto Rico's infrastructure and closed key institutions such as hospitals and public schools. There really are no words to describe the toll that the virus has taken on our collective mental health, as individuals and collectively. However, people that I spoke to, everybody said that they were stressed and anxious. Some struggled with being forced back to work, others taking care of multiple generations. I myself am in a household with 4 generations. Both my mother and my grandmother were hospitalized for COVID-19. I am very lucky that both of them are alive, but my story is not uncommon for Latino families. So we have a lot of people. Thank God we have a good amount of space. But I actually had to leave the house to do this presentation because there were so many people at home. So I was very lucky to have access to another space to give this talk. Many are taking care of multiple generations. You have children taking care of children while parents have to go to work. Some feeling, a lot of people are, even though in the short run they might feel secure, many fear for the long run, for themselves and for the community, the collective community. There's a lot of sadness, as Amie talked about with the isolation. Immigrant communities, the most important resource we have and the most important network we have is our families. And not being able to have access to our families has created a whole host of social and economic and mental health problems in our communities. US embassies around the world are closed for visa interviews. So you have thousands of Latino families who have paid thousands of dollars in lawyer fees and US immigration fees. And so we see this administration hurrying up to open certain sectors of the economy and institutions, but not other ones that would be able to facilitate family reunion. So that is also causing stress and anxiety in our community. Next slide, please. In terms of the labor market, in 2017, only 16% of the Latinx community reported being able to work from home. We comprise a large part of the essential, of what is termed essential workers in all different fields: food, agriculture, grocery stores, hospitals, public services. So it stands to reason the vast majority of Latinos are considered essential workers. And according to a study by the Pew Research Center conducted from March 19th to March 24th, 40% of the Latinx community had received pay cuts versus 27% of the general population. 29% had been laid off or fired from work versus 20% of the population. Many small businesses in the Latinx community expressed difficulty or complete lack of access to receiving small business loans from the stimulus package. And on April 20th, the LA Times reported that couples filing jointly with mixed statuses. So you can imagine one person is a citizen, the other person is undocumented, an undocumented worker. These families were not eligible for stimulus pay. Not even the American citizen received the stimulus pay. So 2 minutes, perfect. So we see that not only are tax-paying immigrants not receiving stimulus pay, American citizens who are married to undocumented workers are not receiving stimulus pay. And many Latinos, many people from the Latinx community who do qualify for certain benefits are afraid to go to public institutions and use them, even if they do qualify. And so in that case, it can be where parents are undocumented and children are, and parents can go to institutions to get assistance for their children, but they prefer not to out of fear of deportation and being separated from their children. Oh, next slide. I tried to change the slide myself. I have a couple of different themes that came up with the folks that I talked to from the Latinx community. And you can see them there yourself. One of the biggest concerns that people talked about was their children's education. My sister is also an economist. Her name is Cruz Bueno, and her research is on virtual schools. She finds that children who attend virtual schools do much worse in math and English on standardized tests than children who go to regular brick and mortar schools. And these are schools that are designed to be virtual. So we can only imagine the negative impacts on our children of this crisis and the lack of accessibility that they are experiencing. Next slide, please. These are some quotes that I took from people that I talked to that I thought would be nice to share. There was the discussion of many of us are also afraid for our lives. Police brutality against the Black and Latino community and Black Latinos. The need for Black Latino households are the least likely to have bank accounts. So we need the government to send stimulus to apps on our phones. We need the need for testing, mobile testing sites in Latino communities. And the financial stresses as well. Oh, next slide, please. 0, I'm done. I just wanted to say one last thing about moving forward, and it is about shared humanity. That these protests that we're having right now, these righteous riots, are about us, our people asserting our humanity at such a difficult time in the world. And so I want us to think about what it is in these times of crisis that people need, not governments and corporations. And I picked this picture because it reminds me of me and my family. I thought it would be a positive way to end on the very difficult topics that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Cruz. Next, we have Judith LeBlanc, Director of the Native Organizers Alliance, a national Native organizing network that provides Native organizers, tribal governments, and nonprofits with training and support for strategic campaign planning and community engagement. Over to you, Judith.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this circle. Thank you. I'm honored to be with you. All of your words are make my heart very full, because I believe that we're in a magic movement moment, and it's conversations like this that will guarantee the kind of structural change that is needed. Native Organizers Alliance, well, I'm a way urban Indian. I'm a proud citizen of the Caddo tribe of Oklahoma, and I have a Boston accent, which opens me up to a lot of mockery in Indian country. And we are a national network that grew out of the Organizing for the Indian Health Improvement Act, which subsequently was rolled into the Affordable Care Act. So we were born over 10 years ago of grassroots organizing in Indian communities. And one of the insights of the Indian organizers was there was no place in Indian country where we were training organizers to reflect on the centuries-old building of community and organizing ourselves in order to be a guide in the present moment. So we are a training and an organizing network. And one of the things, as an urban Indian, I walk, with a high heel on one and a mock on the other. And the truth is that we in Indian country have a vast array of experiences when it comes to the impact of the pandemic. But the truth is that the pandemic, for all of our peoples, for all of our tribes, for all of the people in this country, has been the biggest interruption to the political life, the economic life, and to cultural continuity. And I think the response to COVID in Indian communities and now in our country and all of the world is one of the biggest interruptions to the dominant racist narrative that plagues our country and the world. And we share a deal with the Black community. Our histories are tightly together because our histories in Native history and Black history are fundamental to the development of the economic system. And due to that reality, we share many of the same problems that African Americans and other communities of color face, the same problems that we face due to the systemic racism. But I think in Minneapolis, we had an experience there that I think shows how important it is for Indigenous communities in a time of pandemic and a time of militarized policing, that we stand so firmly with the Black community. You know, the protests, for those of you who know Minneapolis, the protests began in the heart of the Indian community, which we share with an immigrant Somali community. They were the same streets that the American Indian Movement, the organization, was founded in 1968. And the reason why the American Indian Movement in 1968 was founded was because of police brutality. And so in the heart of the Indian community, we have seen new ways of using our traditional foods to respond to the pandemic. Many of the chefs, Indian chefs, there's not many, the 4 Indians in Minneapolis who had restaurants began to prepare traditional foods in our Indian Center that they were delivering to hundreds of elders who could not go to the markets. And when the murder of George Floyd happened, they transitioned into shifting into high gear of delivering groceries, because during the protests, the only supermarkets and fast food places were either shut down or had been firebombed. So in Minneapolis, our situation with the Minneapolis Police Department is very well known. A year ago, the same policeman involved with the murder of George Floyd had killed an Indian man. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis released last year that Indian women were twice as likely to be stopped while walking or driving, and after being stopped, twice as likely to be arrested than any other racial group in the city of Minneapolis. So our stand with the Black community in total transformation of community policing is strong and underway and gives me a great source of hope. So in Indian country, we have a unique situation that flows from our history, that we are nations within a nation, that we are the only peoples that have collectively owned land that is self-governed and has been since the beginning of time, and that we have systems of organizing our community to respond to crises that have been utilized since dirt. And we have a legal status that is at the core of the kind of system change that's needed in order for Indian peoples to be able to not only survive, to revive, and to become the nations that we are within this nation. Of course, at the heart of treaties and the striving for achieving our sovereignty is the fact that this pandemic has shined a light on one of the biggest treaty right that's been long denied, which is access to healthcare from birth to death. The pandemic has also revealed the historic denial and under-resourcing of the healthcare that is provided. And therefore, we suffer from many of the same quote-unquote pre-existing conditions that make us highly susceptible to the COVID-19. And we have tribal governments who have long been governing in a culture of scarcity, resources extremely limited in our healthcare systems, on relations and urban communities. For example, at the beginning of the pandemic in March, there were only 35 ICU beds in the entire Indian health service system. Many thousands of Indians live hundreds of miles, hours away from the nearest hospital because of hospital shutdowns. And the truth is that Indian communities have become, especially the Navajo Reservation and Pueblos in New Mexico, have become more infectious than New York City. Some of the figures that show the devastation of the impact of COVID-19, for example, 60% of the people who've died in New Mexico are American Indian. We are only 8% of the population. Similar figures also for Arizona and in Mississippi. So the pandemic has perhaps created the biggest threat to our cultural continuity ever in history. The wisdom keepers, the elders, are the ones who are dying. They are the ones who guarantee our language continuity. We have faced pandemics in the past, but the truth is that in the 21st century, we have faced this pandemic with a surge of creativity, a surge of realizing the power we have in our communities. So for example, online, 21st century Indians, what we've done is to create a social distance powwow. Over 100,000 Indians are participating and sharing songs and dances and honoring our frontline workers, honoring our graduates who have no graduations. We have a resurgence of culture in the sense of we have online Zoom calls where B is done, intertribal sharing of culture. We also have the Navajo government and many others that are actually suing the government for our right to healthcare. They requested safety equipment and instead were shipped hundreds of body bags. But the truth is that we have the possibility of coming out of this pandemic even stronger, even more closely aligned with other communities, especially Black communities, but also realizing that we are all related. When the pandemic, I will end this, when the pandemic began to hit this country, I live in Harlem, and every day there were over 30, 40 sirens all day long. I live in one of the most infectious zip codes in the country. But what I want when everybody celebrate the essential workers with music and calling out from the windows every day at 7 o'clock, which we still do, I understood that people began to realize that we are all related, a basic indigenous concept. We are all related. And I believe that the solutions will come to changing the systems, both policing, healthcare, and all of those that are impacted by systemic racism, by coming together and realizing that we're all related. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Our fourth speaker is Michelle Holder, Assistant Professor of Economics at John Jay College, City University of New York, and author of African American Men and the Labor Market During the Great Recession. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Lynda. And allow me to say that being on this panel with Cruz and Amie and Judith is really an honor for me. And as both Cruz and Judith have noted, there's so many overlaps between the communities that Amie and Cruz and Judith talked about and the community that I'm going to talk about. So let me get right to it. So I'm a labor economist. So unsurprisingly, what I will talk about are the labor market dimensions of COVID on the Black community, on women, and an intersection of the two, which would be Black women. And let me also add that when I say Black women, I mean Afro-Latinas, I mean African-American, I mean Caribbean, I mean African. So it's a sort of, you know, umbrella term that I use for Black women in general. There will be times that I will use the terminology African-American, but for the most part, I'm talking about Black women writ large in the United States. So some of the things that we know about COVID and joblessness on women of color, we know first that the pandemic resulted in a disproportionate impact on joblessness among women, given our overrepresentation in service industries. Now, previous downturns typically have resulted in higher unemployment rate for men than for women, given men's overrepresentation in goods producing industries like construction and manufacturing that are more sensitive to economic downturns as aggregate for demand for goods declines, right? So not necessarily for services, but for goods. However, the current downturn is unlike any other in recent history because it didn't arise out of a financial crisis, but a health crisis. So the country hasn't quite followed the sort of expected path of a cyclical downturn because industries were not, for lack of a better term, organically affected. They were targeted for shutdowns and slowdowns. So last month's unemployment rate released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we all saw it was about 13%, 13.3 to be exact. But we do know that that figure is a woeful underestimate. In fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, whom we rely on in the United States for labor force stats, openly admitted in the same report that the unemployment rate was underestimated to the degree of about 3 percentage points. So in fact, the actual unemployment rate in the US is, you know, probably more like 16, 17%. And we could quibble about, well, there are better measures, but let's face it, this is the measure that most people, particularly our policymakers, pay attention to. Whatever the unemployment rate is, we all know that it's the highest in terms of recorded data on the unemployment rate in the US, with the exception of the month of April, and of course the Great Depression. So we're clearly in a significant downturn, and the natural next question becomes, well, when will we get back to normal? I'm not going to get to that at the moment. I will if there's time, but what I want to talk about is if we disaggregate the unemployment numbers by gender, we see, right, that men's unemployment rate was lower than women's. The male unemployment rate for the month of May, the latest month for which we have data, was about 12%, but for women, it was roughly 14%. But once we dig a little deeper into those numbers, a clearer picture emerges. Now, I do want to point out, and this will relate back to something Judith said, that the BLS, short for Bureau of Labor Statistics, doesn't regularly provide unemployment rate data for Native Americans as a whole, nor for Asian women separately, not at least in an accessible fashion. One could, you know, data mine for that, but in terms of these monthly releases depicting the labor market situation in the United States, you can't find data readily accessible about the Native American community. You can find data about the Asian community in the United States, but not disaggregated by gender. So I want to put that caveat, but what I can say is that at the same time that we don't have data disaggregated to the degree that we would like, as Judith pointed out, and this is what I tell my students all the time. I actually ask them in a class that I teach, what demographic do you think is the poorest in the United States? Inevitably, they'll say African Americans, or they'll say Latinxes. And I have to point out to them, no, it's actually Native Americans in the US who are the poorest. So piggybacking on what Judith said, as one might imagine, you know, what happened in terms of joblessness among people of color and women in this country, you might imagine it was really worse for Native Americans. So what I'm about to say, the analogous statistics for Native Americans, and particularly Native American women, probably exceed this. But looking at groups as a whole, the highest unemployment rate was among Latinxes. I think Cruz might have mentioned that, nearly 18%. Then African Americans or Black Americans at 16, nearly 17%, Asians at 15%, and whites at just over 12%. Again, these, okay, I've got 4 minutes. These estimates are underestimates, simply because the Bureau of Labor Statistics misclassified furloughed workers as employed and did it consecutively for the months of both April and May. So our unemployment numbers are incredibly off, but it's what I have to work with, so it's what I'm going to work with. In breaking out the groups by gender, the groups that I just talked about, we see that Latinas have the highest unemployment rate at nearly 20%, then Black women at 16.5%, and then white women at 13%. So I want to take a pause for the few minutes I have left to mention, you know, the question often arises, why is there this long-standing unemployment rate gap if you just relegate it to Blacks and whites, right? So I can point to, you know, human capital acquisition. There is still the case that whites complete college at a higher rate than Blacks. So whites completed at a rate of about 33%, Blacks at about 22%. You know, that accounts for some of it. But also, there's still very salient evidence that discrimination still exists in the labor market. I can point to a bevy of audit studies, and also, some of you may be familiar with an article done by Andrea Bella back in 1982, which showed pretty much quantitatively that women were clearly discriminated against in the labor market. But so I want to point out, I don't want to talk necessarily about the long-standing gap between Blacks and whites in unemployment, but that question does come about. Why is there this gap, aside from any differences in occupational or industrial distribution? So going back to the groups that were really disaffected, Latinas, African Americans, if we drill down even further in terms of what happened during not necessarily the recovery period, but between April and May, when unemployment ticked down a little bit, it didn't tick down for Black women. And so the question is, you know, why didn't that happen? So I looked to what were the industrial and occupational distribution differences between Black women and white women, and Black women and Black men. These are the typical groups that, when you talk about Black women in the labor market, the groups they're normally compared against would be white women and Black men, right? So I wanted to get a sense of what was happening with Black women's industrial distribution. Lynda, can I just do a quick time check?
You have 1 minute.
Okay, so quick and dirty, in terms of the industrial distribution, in accommodation and food services, which is an industry that clearly was leveled during the pandemic, this is an industry where African Americans, Black Americans are incredibly overrepresented, but not whites, including not white women. So this was one factor that played into this higher unemployment rate, or this unemployment rate that did not tick down for Black women. The other thing is the healthcare and social services sector. This sector is huge in the United States. It employs 14% of all people, all workers in the US. But for Black women, it employs 28%, so double that. And in a conversation I had, I got to give a shout out to Yana Rogers, who's on the call. I asked her, she did a presentation similar to this one. And I had not drilled down to kind of see, well, why did, you know, what happened with Black women losing jobs in that industry? One might think in a healthcare crisis, you don't want to lose healthcare workers. And what Yana explained to me was that it's really home health aides, right? So women of color, we tend to be crowded in the lower ranks of healthcare occupations, right? So we're well overrepresented when I get to the occupational stuff. We're overrepresented in terms of healthcare support we're not in terms of healthcare practitioners, which would be the doctors, et cetera, with the exception of nurses. So in healthcare and social services, nearly 1/3 of Black women in the country work in that industry. That industry did suffer losses, and Black women were disproportionately affected. From the perspective of occupational distribution, number one, food prep and serving. We all know that occupation was absolutely leveled during this pandemic. And this is an occupation, and Cruz, I'm sure would agree with me, where Blacks and Latinxes are incredibly overrepresented.
Sorry, Michelle.
Yes. Okay. So yes. So the final thing I'll say is that from an occupational perspective, the vulnerabilities for Black women were along the lines of food prep and serving, where we're overrepresented, in healthcare support, which I just mentioned, and as a lot of us on this call know, in the personal care and service industry, where women in writ large and women of color in particular really had vulnerabilities in terms of this pandemic. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Michelle. We will now open up the discussion for questions and comments from the audience. The format for the Q&A segments is going to be as follows. 2 minutes per comment or question, and we're running a little bit behind time, so I'd like to remind you or ask you to please pay attention to that. To ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand by clicking on participants on your screen and then clicking on raise hand. And if you're called on, your name will be called and you will be unmuted by Jilly, who is our host. We will take 3 comments at a time before switching to the panelists to respond. If you have any difficulty using Zoom to get attention to your question or comments, please type your name, affiliation, and question to the host via chat, and Jihi will read your question out loud on your behalf. And I will be calling on the panelists by name to respond to the questions or comments as they come up. All right, so.
Great. So our first question is going to be from Madiha. Madiha, I just prompted you to unmute, so you can go ahead.
Hi, I'm Madiha Nadeem, and I'm a PhD scholar in gender studies here in Bristol University, UK. My question is, what I heard from all the speakers, the threat against diversity and multiculturalism. It seems the hyper-nationalism is emerging as a great threat in highly developed societies. So I was just thinking, and I would like to hear about your opinion regarding, is it a time to change the concept of citizenship? Do we need another counter narrative? And how can we, join our struggles against these kind of hegemonic powers and structures? Thank you.
Great. And then our second question is going to be from Bansari. Bansari, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, my name
Go
is
ahead.
Amber. I'm a graduate student at UMass Boston. And I had a question regarding remote work, because I thought it was very interesting that remote work is always given as an alternative to encouraging women to enter the labor force. But there's already been reports of how it's increased the women's burden at home, and it might actually not be as beneficial. And I was wondering if we could expand on that.
Great, thank you. And then our third question is going to be from Hannah. Hannah, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello, my name is Hanna Szymborska from Birmingham City University in the UK. I was moved by all of the contributions, and I would like to thank to all the speakers because I have so many thoughts and questions. So thank you so much. But for now, I have a question to Dr. Cruz Bueno. Could you explain the origins of the term Latinx? And I was wondering, is it a term that's widely used by the Latino community itself? And is it a preferred term to Latino or Latina? Thank you.
All right, so we have three questions. Maybe I'll call on Cruz to go with the last question, and then I'll open it up to all the panelists, because I think the other two questions were probably apply to all of you and to your comments.
So first of all, thank you so much, Hannah, for the lovely words. I think we were all really happy. You know, this is a difficult subject, but really excited to have the platform through IAFFE to discuss what our communities are facing. And the term Latinx, it's a relatively new term. It originates from the fact that Spanish is gendered, very gendered language. So it's usually the case that when people say, talk about our community, they would say Latino, which is the masculine version. The idea behind Latinx is that it is not, first of all, it's not just inclusive of all gender expressions, but it's also, and it's inclusive of, it includes men, women, and all gender expressions, so that it's not a gender term. So it includes queer, it includes women, it includes men, it includes trans, the whole spectrum. In terms of popularity, there has been some academic debate. I think that I would say that now, a vast majority of scholars that work in our community do use the term Latinx because it's seen as more progressive, it's seen as more inclusive. But I will be honest with you, right? Most, older people in our community, my parents don't use that term, so I think it's relatively new. There have been discussions and debates in academia about the use. Some people push back on it and say it's an Anglicization of Spanish. But I would say I teach in a Black Studies department in upstate New York. Most young people, this is the term they use, is Latinx. So I also use it from the perspective of it being more inclusive of everybody in our community.
All right, and so the other questions, like I said, were quite general, and I think each of you should take the opportunity, perhaps, if you wish. Would anyone like to go first?
Well, on the remote work question, I can't pretend to be an expert in terms of time use, but there is someone among the participant list who is, and that would be Dr. Nina Banks. I'm sure almost all of us could attest to the validity and the truth in that question in terms of, even for those of us who can work remotely, we also have, care responsibilities. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and it's been difficult to juggle, I should say, working remotely, though I must admit I'm fortunate to be able to do that and also care for my daughter. And I'm sure that's a situation for many, many of us in this call right now. But please do look at the work of Nina Banks, who talks about, the burdens of women of color and their time.
I think one other, can people hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure if I was muted still. I would think one thing to add to Michelle, and maybe Michelle, you could speak on this more since your area is the labor market, is that many women are concerned about being able to re-enter the labor market after this. Without healthcare, without childcare, taking care of multiple generations. So again, I'll use my example from my household, taking care of a toddler, 2 people who went, who were hospitalized for COVID-19. In the mix of that, and this is something that I have in my slide that I think relates to it. You have a lot of people in the Latino community self-medicating because what is being prioritized is COVID-19. And you have things like hypertension emergencies where people go to the hospital and they should be hospitalized, but they're sent back home. So they, the example, my dad went back to the yard and got some leaves and made a tea and ate some garlic and said, that will fix my hypertension problem. And I said, I don't know about that. So I think that so caring for children, caring for elders, a lot of women are concerned about re-entering the labor market. Another big concern, and Michelle can speak to that more, is violence in the households. So based on hotline calls in the United States and in Latin America, percentages of calls have increased. People reporting, and not just to violence, gender violence and household violence hotlines, but also suicide hotlines. So there is all these host of problems that people are experiencing in the household that is literally making it impossible to work. And really highlighting the need for good, affordable, universal healthcare and childcare. And especially we need it, women, and women in our communities.
So Judith and Amie, I was wondering whether either or both of you would like to respond to the first question, which was whether it's time to change the concept of citizenship and how different groups can join their struggle together.
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, it's a huge question, deserving of much more time than we have. And I think, you know, Madiha, you talked about the trend against multiculturalism, and I think we need to call that what it is. This hyper-nationalism is really racism, it's xenophobia, it's exclusion on the basis of many dimensions of one's humanity and identity. And so it plays out internationally. We're seeing it in the, you know, aside from what's happening in our own country here in the US, but in Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban, and what, you know, using kind of the cover of COVID actually to exert his power through states of emergency that are really constraining and redefining what it means in that society. So passing a law that eliminates the possibility of changing your gender identity, of very harsh kinds of regulations related to immigration. And so I think, you know, ultimately the way we combat this is through alliances and allyship, and that's going to look different in different contexts. And that, you know, citizenship, I think we're trying to redefine now, that anyone on the ground in the US is a citizen. I mean, by definition, regardless of how you look at paperwork, you know, I mean, that's what I think we need to be moving toward. And so again, it's a very deep and large question, but those are a few thoughts on my side.
I think something that's been very uplifting for me in this time of the coronavirus is that this basic indigenous concept of relationality, and how we're in relationship with the natural world, we're in relationship with each other, and that it goes far beyond our immediate situation. And I was saying earlier that this sense that developed during the pandemic that the health of a healthcare worker is as important as the health of my family was very broad feeling, and people had a sense of this relationality, which is a really fundamental and basic indigenous concept. And along with that concept from an indigenous framework is that science and spirituality and values travel alongside one another. And there are times when science doesn't know what it doesn't know. And the coronavirus is a very profound example of science not knowing what it doesn't know and struggling to catch up. And in these kind of times when practice and science can answer questions for us, we have to rely on our values. We have to rely on our spirituality. And for Native peoples, that's been a very powerful process of weaving together science and spirituality, especially in the 21st century. So I would say that in reaction to the murder of George Floyd, what I was surprised by was the depth of the understanding of this fundamental indigenous concept, that we are all related. Never have we, any of us, no matter what our age, and I'm an elder, we have never experienced the kind of multiracial actions in the street that persist no matter what militarized policing is done, no matter what, from small towns to big cities. I was doing a training with Indian youth last night who are prepared to offer Trump a welcome to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they'll be in the streets there in a good way. And with Black and white people together and immigrants together. And I think that that is the answer to hypernationalism. It's this idea that in time of crisis, we have to rely on our values and our spirit, and for indigenous peoples all over the world, our spirituality. And I would end by saying that indigeneity is not an Indian thing. Indigeneity is an understanding of place and of history. And our cosmology is that time is on a continuum, and the past and the future, our ancestors and our descendants that those two things are brought together in the present by how we walk, by what we do today, and what we do today matters. And so this relationality and an understanding of that continuum of time, they're powerful weapons in overcoming hypernationalism and racial division.
And I want to, add to that, Judith, because that was very powerful and very beautiful. And as Amie said, that it is really about the young people out in the streets putting their bodies and collectively getting out there and fighting white supremacy. And I think one of the most important things is that people, at least it seems, want to learn and are willing to listen. Some, right? Not all. But even moving from an econ department to a Black Studies department, teaching Black Studies classes, teaching Black political economy, and having white students in those classes, they are just as angry as my students of color that they have not been taught the actual history, that they have not, that they have been lied to, that their educational system has been complete propaganda. And you see, now there's young white people who are angry, right? And they're angry righteously as well, joining our people. And I think one of the things about these protests and these riots is that they are righteous. We have to place our demands on the state, right? Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. What I heard a lot talking to people when I was preparing this talk, there was a lot of talk about voting and making sure that we register our communities to vote. And there's, Malcolm X has that one saying, it's either the ballot or the bullet. And if you don't want revolution, then we have to try at least with the ballot. I think it is so important at local, state, federal elections, us ourselves, people from our communities, because we see that it makes a difference when our people are in power. And so I think it's challenging white supremacy. It's putting our bodies on the street. It's being in solidarity with each other. And I think it's so important. All of these communities that we are talking about are interconnected, are the same communities. And so I think that is really one of the most inspiring things. And that's how I think we are going to make headway into fighting the hyper-nationalism we see, the white supremacy we see, and thinking about global citizenship, what it means to be stewards of the earth together. And so as difficult as this time is, it's also inspiring. It's also quite inspiring.
All right, thank you, Cruz, and Michelle, Amie, and Judith. We have 15 more minutes, and so we really have only time for one more round of questions. And I understand there are 4, so we'll take them all together. Jahi, do you want to?
Great, yes. So our first question, Jala Alston had her hand up, so you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shayla. I'm an undergraduate student at Columbia University studying economics. Dr. Bueno, your sister, invited me. And my question was essentially, so I'm currently located in rural South Georgia, and I've seen a lot of like inconsistencies in like recording COVID, you know, like especially considering like I'm in a very like majority Black area. And so something that I was wondering if you guys could speak to in your own like separate research was like, you know, getting around issues of like inconsistency in like recording health outcomes for people in areas where like they literally just may be outside of like the network of a lot of healthcare like opportunities and things of that nature, like especially for people in rural areas. I mean, I go to school in a large metropolitan area, so I definitely understand, you know, the differences.
Great. Then our next question, I'm actually going to read. We got a couple typed in. So this is from Alyssa for Michelle. Given the higher unemployment rates for Black and Latinx women, how has their relative access to enhanced unemployment benefits been? So that's our second question. And then next, I'm going to call on Carrie Cruz to ask your question and unmute now.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Cruz Bueno, Cruz Bueno's sister and economist. My question, I'm more focused usually on what can we do next and what are the policy implications and what have they been? So my question is, what would be one policy that could be implemented or needs to be implemented tomorrow that addresses some of the issues that you guys have talked about today? Like, for example, one thing that came to my mind was how Latinx and Blacks were less likely to get business loans during. So what does that mean? How could that policy have changed to be less part of reinforcing structural racism?
Great, thank you. And then our final question that I will read on behalf of Jessica is also to Cruz. So when you speak about the health and mortality rates, you included Texas, Florida, Arizona, and Puerto Rico. Are you speaking about the potential mortality rate or about the current COVID-19 mortality rate? If it's during COVID-19, what's the source for the conclusions, since the official numbers from the health department in Puerto Rico are quite low? Thanks.
So I can answer that one real fast. That's where cases are starting to rise. I'm sorry, I probably went through those really fast. So that's where cases are actually starting to increase. Puerto Rico is you know, Puerto Ricans, they are US citizens, but they are part of the Latinx community. Cases are starting to rise in Puerto Rico. And then you see in these other places, Florida, Texas, Arizona, that have large Latino populations, large Latinx populations. The numbers are also starting to increase. So there, what I was saying is that we have to be careful and be vigilant. That's what I meant to say. Thank you for the clarification.
All right, so the first question was about getting around inconsistencies in reporting COVID, and I wondered if, Amie, you might like to get us started with that?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, broadly speaking, obviously, if we can't measure what we're seeing, we don't know what is happening. And so fundamentally, figuring out why there are gaps in the recording of cases is huge. What does that mean? What are the underlying reasons? Is that simply because people are not seeking care and are sick at home and not being counted? We know there was a huge issue with testing in this country, so that's probably part of it. But you know, I can speak again in other countries. I mentioned briefly just a fundamental reluctance to put queer people to put themselves into institutions that have historically discriminated against, have you know, they've received mistreatment, they've been misgendered, their confidentiality has been breached. So. But what I would say, so it speaks to a much more kind of structural transformation that's needed. But right now, for many queer people, we're totally invisible in all of this. And we may be visible through our other kinds of intersectional identities, but as queer people, we're invisible. And you know, I have a friend who says that invisibility is actually in some ways worse than discrimination, because with discrimination, you know exactly what you're dealing with. If you're not even visible, then you don't know how, you know, it's hard to know where and how to target your efforts. And I'm speaking more probably outside of the U.S. context, because I think we've made some good progress in that. But so those are a few thoughts.
Thank you. Michelle, there was a question about differential access to unemployment benefits, which was directed at you. So would you like to respond? Or, I think you're muted.
All right, Lynda, could you just repeat Alyssa's question for me?
So what I have down here was differences in access to unemployment benefits between. Alyssa, do you want to clarify? Do you want to remind us?
I can reread the question,
Sure,
which
okay.
is given the higher unemployment rates for Black and Latinx women, how has their relative access to enhanced unemployment benefits been?
How has access to enhanced unemployment benefits been?
Given the differences in unemployment rates between Black and Latinx women.
Yeah, I'm still not clear on the question. Is it that, yeah, I'm a little, if Alyssa could chime in.
Oh, sorry, thanks. I just had to wait to get unmuted. Hi, Michelle. Hi, everyone. This is
Alyssa.
I was just asking that given the higher rates of unemployment among women of color, right, this is also happening at the same time that there have been federal provisions, right, for higher unemployment benefits. But what has their access been like to those enhanced unemployment benefits? Have they been tough to get? Do you have any sense about that?
Yeah.
Has it compensated in any way? Or
right.
Not?
So, yeah, Alyssa, no, I mean, I have to admit, I don't know whether or not it's been harder for women of color to access the enhanced unemployment benefits. And by enhanced, are you talking about the $600 extra per week?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't have a sense in terms of whether it's been harder for women of color, given the fact that Latinas and Black women have higher unemployment rates than white women. I don't know if that also translates into inequitable access to these enhanced benefits. So I don't know.
It was my sense, the people I talked to, there was one person who did have the enhanced benefits. They said that they were able to access them within once they applied, it came through in 2 weeks. However, this person is a citizen and a documented worker. So I think we have to keep in mind that people from all of our communities do work. Like in the US, we have an informal sector where people get paid in cash. Undocumented workers can't access these funds. Many of them didn't lose their job, as we talked about. So that you do have a group of people who, even if they're tax-paying undocumented workers, are unable to access, and that's a big problem. A big problem in our community.
Thank you. And the last question was regarding the policy implications. What kinds of policies, would you like to see implemented right away? And I was hoping Judith would get it started with that, but I think you can all chime in as well.
Oh, just
I think you'll need to be unmuted.
Yeah, apologies. There we go.
Okay, good. I have been on so many Zoom calls. I feel like I know everything that can go wrong. I think the most important immediate policy change that we need, short of national healthcare and nationalizing, the private healthcare system. My daughter works for the largest healthcare. She's an essential worker for the largest healthcare corporation in the U.S. that got money from the CARES Act that was passed, and they've given big bonuses to the CEO and others, and have been laying off workers in hospitals where the COVID rate is spiking. So short of that, I think that there should be a move to fully fund to new heights of public health services of all kinds, and $20 billion should be allocated for tribal communities. That's the estimated cost that has been made for dealing with the health crisis, the COVID crisis, but as well social services and infrastructure issues that limit our ability to respond to this crisis. So public funding, congressional act to fund public health to new heights, and then 20 billion immediately to tribal governments to deal with the crisis.
Thank you, Judith. Michelle, Amie, Cruz, would any of you like to add to that? We do have about 3 minutes or so not very much time, but perhaps there might be something you want to say before we wrap up.
I think it's really important to provide benefits and stimulus benefits to undocumented workers and protect undocumented workers at this time. Cash transfers to apps, cash transfers via apps on people's phones. There needs to be a path to citizenship in this country for all undocumented workers. And I also think, these are a lot, but I think that this is the time to push for reparations for the African-American community. Those are some of my policy implications.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in. I agree with you completely, Cruz, on those points. And just to add a couple of others, I mean, the LGBTIQ community just won a huge victory in the Supreme Court for employment protections, which, it doesn't translate immediately to non-discrimination in the workplace, but I think it is a huge milestone. And I wish that could be the case around the world. I think that from a policy perspective, in terms of foreign assistance in the era of COVID, that what we advocates need to do, or those involved in foreign assistance work and international work, is really hold those who are responding to this pandemic hold their feet to the fire to make sure their funds, the money that's going in to address the pandemic is meeting the needs of all communities, that they are ensuring that there is an inclusive approach, that a lot of agencies are very good at looking at sort of the gender dimensions, but so they're good at gendering, but they're really bad at queering. And gender is defined very much as cisgender women and girls, and that view needs to be expanded. So that's sort of an international foreign policy issue.
30 seconds, Michelle.
Yeah, and I did want to just add that, issues regarding full employment, right? The Federal Reserve has a big role to play in terms of helping the US achieve full employment once we get out of this pandemic. And someone that I've worked with, Janelle Jones at the Groundwork Collaborative, talks about this, the Black women best. And so tying our well-being to indicators tied to marginalized groups like Black women. If this helps Black women, then it's going to help everyone. And speaking of that, I just want to also mention, in terms of the disaggregation of data, that Dr. Rhonda Sharp, who may or may not be on this call, also does a lot of work where she disaggregates this data that we all use, where we need to dig a little deeper.
Well, thank you all very much for your thought-provoking insights into this important topic. I know I've certainly learned a lot in the last hour and a half. Thank you to the organizers, James Hines and Jihi Jolly, and also to the members of the audience for contributing to such a successful panel. We will soon be sending out an email with a link to the recording of today's discussion, as well as information about future events. Thank you, be well, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, Lynda. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one. Enjoy your summer.
Thank you.